Ma'am, what are you doing on this property?
This is my home. I'm watering my garden.
I need ID. You don't look like you live here.
Officer, what is that supposed to mean? I do live here. I'm Judge Patricia Williams.
Yeah, we'll see about that.
It was 7:23 a.m. on a quiet Tuesday in September, and the morning sun was just beginning to touch the manicured lawns of an upscale neighborhood. Judge Lillian Harper was outside, watering her flower beds in gray sweatpants and a simple t-shirt, her hair tied back in a ponytail. Her routine was peaceful, familiar, ordinary, but in a few moments, her calm would be shattered in a way she never imagined, and the events that followed would shock an entire city. Before we go any further, I have to ask you, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, and if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe because this story is going to get intense. Lillian had served on the federal bench for over a decade. She was respected for her sharp mind, her fairness, and her unflinching dedication to justice. Her home reflected her life, a beautiful colonial-style house, meticulously kept, with a garden she tended herself. There was nothing unusual about this morning, except that Officer Damon Reed was driving through her neighborhood on what would become a career-defining patrol. Reed had been patrolling for 3 hours when he received a call about a suspicious person moving between houses. The caller described a black woman in casual clothes who appeared out of place. The area was known for its low crime rate, but Reed treated the report as serious. Without checking property records or confirming addresses, he pulled into Lillian's driveway with his lights flashing. Lillian looked up from her roses, confused. A police cruiser had never pulled into her driveway before. She approached the officer with a friendly smile, assuming he might have a routine question or needed directions. She had no idea that in the next minutes, she would be treated as a suspect in her own home. Reed stepped out of the car and immediately demanded, "Ma'am, what are you doing on this property?" "This is my home," Lillian replied calmly. "I'm watering my garden." "I need ID." "You don't look like you live here," he shot back. Lillian froze for a brief second, then spoke clearly. "Officer, I do live here. My name is Judge Lillian Harper." Reed didn't pause. He just stared, unconvinced. "Yeah, we'll see about that." Her heart sank. She had faced tough litigants, aggressive lawyers, and even criminals in court, but nothing had prepared her for being doubted in her own driveway. She stepped inside to fetch her driver's license and some mail to prove her residence. When she returned, Reed examined the documents, but his expression remained skeptical. "These could be fake," he said, pointing to her ID. He picked up the mail. "Or maybe you stole this." The absurdity was almost surreal. Lillian was calm, but inside, a storm was building. She had done nothing wrong. She was home. She had identification. She had witnesses, all neighbors who could confirm she lived there. Yet Reed continued his aggressive questioning. "Why are you questioning me in my own yard?" she asked. "Has there been a crime?" Reed's answer was vague. "Someone called about suspicious activity. You match the description." Lillian pulled out her phone and started recording. "I have the right to record a public officer performing their duties," she said firmly. Reed's demeanor changed slightly, but he pressed on. He told her to put the phone away. She refused. "What exactly are you investigating?" she asked, "since I've provided ID proving I live here." Instead of backing down, Reed laughed. "If you're really a federal judge, you wouldn't be dressed like this. Probably lying to get out of trouble." Her eyes widened. She was being mocked. She offered to show her judicial identification, but Reed dismissed it. He insisted he would search her property. Lillian calmly told him he had no right without a warrant. Meanwhile, neighbors began to notice the commotion. An elderly woman from 3 houses down, Mrs. Carmichael, stepped forward. "Judge Harper has lived here for nearly 20 years. You're making a mistake," she said. Reed ignored her, insisting she was being deceptive. Lillian realized the situation was escalating beyond reason. She continued filming, documenting every word. The tension was rising, and it was about to explode. Within minutes, backup officers arrived. Officers Nana Ellis and Daniel Park stepped out, quickly assessing the scene. Ellis approached Lillian and listened to her calmly explain the situation. She could see immediately that something had gone horribly wrong. Park went to Reed and asked what had prompted the stop. His answers were contradictory, vague, and unconvincing. Robert Kim, Lillian's next-door neighbor and an attorney, approached and confirmed her identity. Yet Reed refused to relent. He told the other officers that she was being untruthful. Lillian's voice remained steady. "I'm a federal judge," she said. "I've shown you ID. You have no evidence of wrongdoing. This is harassment." Ellis pulled Reed aside. "You need to end this now," she said firmly. "There's overwhelming proof she's telling the truth." Reed refused. He wanted to verify her identity with the courthouse. Ellis argued they were standing in front of her own home, with multiple forms of ID and neighbors confirming who she was. But Reed was determined. The tension escalated to a point where Reed reached for Lillian, trying to handcuff her. She did not resist, but she stated loudly, "I do not consent. This is unlawful. You have no probable cause." Park intervened physically, stopping Reed. Neighbors were watching, shocked. Some were filming. Tears and gasps rippled through the crowd. The scene was chaotic, yet Lillian stayed composed, making a final attempt at reason. "This could have been a simple misunderstanding, but your refusal to see the truth is turning this into a civil rights violation," she said. Reed finally released her, but not before issuing a false citation with incorrect information. Lillian pointed out the errors. Ellis shook her head. Reed crumpled the citation and threw it on her lawn. 45 minutes later, the officers left. Lillian stood in her driveway, surrounded by neighbors, holding her phone with video evidence. She knew this would not end quietly. This was bigger than one morning disruption. This was about accountability, civil rights, and exposing a pattern of misconduct that had been ignored for far too long. From her home office, she began documenting every detail, the times, quotes, behaviors, and the officers' actions. She emailed backups of the video to multiple accounts and called her friend and colleague, Judge Martin Caldwell. He was shocked by her story and advised immediate action. Within 2 hours, complaints had been filed with multiple oversight agencies, including the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The FBI's response was swift. Agents arrived that afternoon to review her footage and interview neighbors. Lillian's recordings, coupled with eyewitness accounts, painted a damning picture. Special Agent Lisa Howard told Lillian that this was one of the most blatant cases of racial profiling she had seen in decades. And just like that, a routine morning in Lillian Harper's garden had transformed into a federal civil rights case with national implications. By the afternoon of that same day, Judge Lillian Harper was already at the center of a federal investigation. FBI agents had arrived at her home, reviewing her video evidence while neighbors gave statements corroborating her account. The calm, routine morning had transformed into a legal and moral crisis for the city's police department. Special Agent Lisa Howard led the investigation. She was a seasoned professional with decades of experience handling civil rights violations and police misconduct. Sitting in Lillian's living room, Howard studied the video closely. Every second revealed Officer Damon Reed's escalating aggression, his refusal to believe multiple forms of identification, and his dismissal of neighbors' testimony. "This behavior isn't just reckless," Howard said. "It's a pattern. And from what we've seen so far, it's not the first time Reed has done this." Lillian listened, trying to remain composed. She had encountered countless cases in court where civil rights were violated, but experiencing it firsthand was different. How could someone like him continue patrolling without consequences? She asked. Howard explained what the preliminary investigation had uncovered. Over the past 6 years, Reed had amassed 43 complaints from citizens, 31 of which involved racial profiling or excessive force. Each time, internal investigations either dismissed the complaint or minimized its significance. Documentation had been altered or ignored, and discipline had been almost non-existent. In total, Reed's actions had already cost the city more than $200,000 in settlements, all under non-disclosure agreements that kept the public unaware. The story was worse than Lillian had imagined. Reed had repeatedly targeted black residents in upscale neighborhoods, stopping them under false pretenses, detaining them, and creating false narratives in official reports. There was even an incident involving a black surgeon leaving his clinic, another involving a professor walking on campus, and yet another with an off-duty black police officer visiting family. Each followed the same pattern: immediate suspicion, dismissal of ID, escalation, and fabrication of a report. Howard continued, the department not only tolerated his behavior, but in some cases rewarded it. He was assigned to minority-heavy areas specifically because his supervisors believed he would intimidate residents into compliance. Lillian's heart sank. This wasn't a single officer acting on his own. It was a systemic problem. She realized that her status as a federal judge had given her protection most people would never have. If this had happened to an ordinary citizen, she said quietly, it would have gone unchecked. They might have even gotten away with it entirely. Meanwhile, the investigation revealed complicity at multiple levels of the police hierarchy. Reed's supervising surgeon, Michael Foster, had repeatedly covered up misconduct. He edited incident reports to remove references to racial profiling, coached Reed on writing false narratives, and intimidated witnesses who attempted to file complaints. Emails showed that Foster strategically assigned Reed to neighborhoods with higher minority populations, fully aware of the officer's tendencies. The department's chief, William Carver, was also implicated. He had been briefed multiple times on Reed's pattern of abuse, but took little to no action. Carver prioritized avoiding negative publicity over accountability, blocking attempts to implement body cameras, civilian review boards, or transparent complaint procedures. As Lillian absorbed the scale of the problem, she realized why her case had become so urgent. This was more than an isolated incident. It was a window into a systemic violation of citizens' civil rights. Every part of the system that was supposed to check Reed's behavior had failed. Over the next week, federal agents conducted extensive interviews with neighbors, former colleagues of Reed, and even officers who had quietly raised concerns in the past. One former colleague admitted, everyone knew Reed had issues with minorities. We just didn't say anything because the system rewarded silence. Lillian's own documentation became a critical piece of evidence. Her video, timestamps, witness statements, and the citation Reed had issued, all incorrect, painted a clear picture of misconduct. She worked with her attorney, Maria Santos, a seasoned civil rights litigator, to ensure nothing would be overlooked. Santos immediately understood the case's broader implications. This isn't just about money, she said to Lillian. It's about forcing a department to face the truth, to change policies, and to prevent this from happening again. As the investigation deepened, the FBI discovered that Reed's recent training on racial bias and constitutional policing, completed just 6 months prior, had been ineffective. He scored poorly on the assessments and openly mocked the need for such training to colleagues. The evidence painted a picture of an officer who knew better, but refused to act ethically. Howard turned to Lillian. You know, Judge Harper, what you have here is unprecedented. Most victims of this kind of misconduct never get the attention you're getting. Your position gave you access that most people wouldn't have, and that's why we're able to act so quickly. Lillian nodded, though the weight of the situation was heavy. She couldn't forget the humiliation she had endured in her own front yard. The laughter, the disbelief, the attempt to arrest her while standing in her driveway. But now, she was channeling that experience into action that could protect countless others. The city itself began to feel the repercussions. As Howard's team compiled evidence, Santos prepared a legal strategy to demand not only monetary compensation but comprehensive reforms. Mandatory body cameras, independent civilian oversight, bias training, and transparent complaint procedures. 3 weeks after the incident, federal agents executed arrests at Reed's home. He was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal crime that carried severe penalties. His supervising sergeant, Michael Foster, faced conspiracy and obstruction of justice charges for destroying evidence and falsifying official documents. And Chief Carver resigned in disgrace, though investigations into his role continued. The news sent shockwaves through the community. Residents who had previously ignored minor complaints about the police suddenly realized the scale of the misconduct and cover-ups. Local media reported the FBI's findings, and public outrage grew quickly. Lillian's story had become a symbol of accountability and justice in the face of systemic failure. At the same time, Lillian and Santos began negotiating with the city for a settlement. The initial offer was $750,000, reflecting the undeniable evidence and the city's desire to limit damage. But Lillian's focus wasn't just financial. She demanded policy changes that would prevent future abuses. Santos strategically leaked information to journalists, ensuring the public knew the full extent of Reed's misconduct. Pressure mounted on city officials. Citizens demanded reform. The mayor, once defensive of the police department, announced support for systemic changes, including the reforms Lillian had requested. Every revelation strengthened Lillian's case. Records showed Reed had been paid extra overtime for assignments in minority neighborhoods, confirming that the department had actively encouraged his pattern of harassment. Public exposure of these facts intensified political and social pressure. The morning sun had barely risen when Judge Lillian Harper sat at her kitchen table, reviewing the latest reports from the FBI. Her front yard incident, once an isolated and humiliating event, had become the epicenter of a federal investigation. The story of her wrongful harassment had captured national attention. Television crews, journalists, and community activists now followed every development. Lillian's phone rang constantly. It was her attorney, Maria Santos, calling with updates on the city's response and the unfolding legal strategy. Santos was relentless. They want to settle quietly, but we're not just going to take money. We're going to force real change, she said firmly. The city's initial offer of $750,000 sat on the table. While significant, Lillian knew it was not enough. Her focus was systemic reform. Mandatory body cameras, transparent complaint processes, civilian oversight boards, and comprehensive racial bias training. Monetary compensation without accountability would be meaningless. Meanwhile, the public's reaction was intense. Community meetings were packed, citizens demanded answers, and local media highlighted every detail of Reed's misconduct. Stories poured in from victims who had previously been silenced by non-disclosure agreements. A black college student shared how he had been wrongfully detained walking home from class. A small business owner told reporters about Reed harassing customers outside his shop. Lillian's experience had opened the floodgates, and suddenly, the city could no longer ignore the pattern of misconduct. Courtroom preparations began. Lillian, a federal judge herself, understood the intricacies of civil rights law better than most. She meticulously documented every interaction, every time-stamped video, and every statement from neighbors. These records became the backbone of a case that was no longer just about her. It was about exposing systemic failures that endangered countless citizens. In the courtroom, Maria Santos presented the evidence with precision. She highlighted Reed's 6-year history of complaints, the internal cover-ups by supervising officers, and the deliberate inaction of the police chief. The judge presiding over the case listened intently, acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the evidence. The facts in front of this court demonstrate more than negligence, Santos stated during one hearing. They demonstrate a deliberate pattern of racial profiling and abuse of power that has been systematically ignored. My client, Judge Lillian Harper, experienced firsthand what countless citizens have endured silently for years. The city tried to push back, emphasizing the settlement offer and arguing that individual officers should bear responsibility, not the department as a whole. But Santos countered, showing internal emails and records proving that Reed's supervisors knew of his behavior and actively allowed it to continue. The evidence painted a damning picture: systemic failure at every level. Outside the courtroom, Lillian spoke publicly about her experience for the first time. She detailed the morning in her garden, the laughter, the disbelief, and the attempt to arrest her. But she emphasized that her position had shielded her in ways most citizens would never have. If I hadn't been a federal judge with legal knowledge and resources, she told reporters, Reed's actions might have gone unchecked, and I wouldn't be standing here today. This case proves the system fails when ordinary citizens cannot protect themselves. The emotional impact of her testimony resonated widely. Other victims appeared alongside her at city council meetings and press conferences, giving accounts of Reed's harassment. The combination of first-hand testimony, video evidence, and the FBI's findings created overwhelming pressure on city officials. As the trial progressed, one dramatic moment stood out. Reed's attorney attempted to discredit Lillian's video evidence, claiming the officer had acted within department policy. Lillian calmly addressed the court. I was standing in my own front yard, watering my garden. My identification, mail, and neighbors confirmed my residency. Yet Officer Reed refused to acknowledge reality. If this isn't evidence of misconduct, I don't know what is. The courtroom murmured. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Video footage, multiple witnesses, and the documented pattern of prior misconduct made it impossible to argue that this was an isolated incident. Back at City Hall, officials scrambled. Public outrage intensified, fueled by widespread media coverage. Business leaders threatened to relocate operations due to reputational concerns. City council meetings turned heated, with residents demanding accountability. Each new revelation weakened the city's position, forcing officials to consider the reforms Lillian and her attorney demanded. Lillian's legal strategy was brilliant. Instead of settling quietly, she used the media attention to amplify pressure for systemic change. Each week brought new revelations about Reed's misconduct, and each revelation made the city's resistance less tenable. Records showed Reed had been specifically requested for assignments in minority neighborhoods, reinforcing the argument that the department had encouraged racial profiling. The public response was swift. Calls for resignations filled local media outlets. Activists organized rallies. Residents flooded council meetings demanding reforms. Lillian's case had become a catalyst for accountability and transparency in policing. Even within the police department, the impact was immediate. Officers who had previously remained silent began speaking out, confirming the patterns of misconduct and cover-ups. Sergeant Foster and Chief Carver faced increasing scrutiny, with their careers unraveling rapidly. The courtroom drama was intense. Every day, Lillian's video footage, testimonies from neighbors, and evidence from the FBI reinforced the severity of Reed's behavior. The city had no choice but to acknowledge wrongdoing. The $750,000 settlement offer was finally accepted, but only after it included the structural reforms Lillian demanded. Judge Lillian Harper had transformed a humiliating, threatening morning into a national story of justice. Her courage and meticulous documentation had not only secured compensation for herself, but forced the city to confront deep systemic issues. As the city implemented reforms, officers received mandatory racial bias training, body cameras became standard, and civilian oversight boards were established. Policies that had shielded misconduct were dismantled, creating safeguards for future generations. And yet, Lillian never forgot the moment in her front yard, the disbelief, the laughter, and the attempt to arrest her. It was a reminder of why the fight for accountability was so necessary. Her morning garden routine had become a powerful lesson. Even one person, armed with courage, evidence, and knowledge, could force systemic change. The morning after the settlement was announced, Judge Lillian Harper sat at her kitchen table once again. But this time, there was a sense of closure mingled with reflection. The $750,000 settlement was significant, but more importantly, it marked the beginning of systemic change in a police department that had allowed misconduct to thrive for years. The city had agreed to implement mandatory body cameras, independent civilian oversight boards, transparent complaint procedures, and regular racial bias training for all officers. Even with the settlement finalized, the public spotlight remained intense. News outlets ran repeated stories on Officer Damon Reed's 6-year history of racial profiling and excessive force complaints. Citizens who had remained silent for years now came forward, emboldened by Lillian's courage. Each new testimony reinforced the evidence that Reed was not an anomaly, but a symptom of a systemic failure in the police department. The FBI investigation had revealed that Reed's supervising sergeant, Michael Foster, and the police chief, William Carver, had both been complicit in allowing his behavior to continue unchecked. Foster faced federal charges for conspiracy and obstruction of justice, while Carver resigned in disgrace as investigations continued into his deliberate inaction. Their careers, once considered untouchable, were effectively ended. Lillian met with Maria Santos one afternoon to review the final reforms. "This is more than a settlement," Santos said. "You've set a precedent that citizens, regardless of status, can demand accountability. You've also made it clear to departments everywhere that misconduct will not be ignored." Lillian nodded, remembering the terror she felt that morning in her driveway. The laughter, the disbelief, and the attempt to arrest her were memories she could never forget. But she had channeled that fear into action that would protect countless others. Meanwhile, the city began the painstaking process of implementing the reforms. Body cameras were issued to every patrol officer. Training programs on constitutional policing and racial bias were overhauled. Civilian review boards were empowered to investigate complaints independently, with authority to enforce disciplinary actions. Complaint procedures were simplified and made public, ensuring that citizens could report misconduct without fear of retaliation or dismissal. Public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Community meetings filled with residents who had long been frustrated with the police department now had a voice. Lillian's story became a symbol of accountability and justice, showing that courage and evidence could overcome systemic negligence. Local activists credited her for opening the door to reform that had been long overdue. In parallel, Officer Reed faced federal charges of deprivation of rights under color of law. The evidence was overwhelming. The videotaped harassment of Lillian, witness testimonies, and the documented history of prior complaints painted a clear picture of repeated misconduct. His arrest 3 weeks after the incident had been a turning point, signaling that the justice system would not tolerate blatant abuse of authority. Sergeant Foster's conspiracy and obstruction of justice charges sent a clear message to supervisors who might consider covering up misconduct. Carver's resignation underscored the accountability expected at the highest levels of leadership. The department, once resistant to change, now had no choice but to embrace reform. Lillian's testimony before the city council became a landmark moment. She spoke not just about the humiliation and threat she endured, but about the broader implications for ordinary citizens. "If this can happen to me," she told council members, "it can happen to anyone." Citizens deserve protection from those sworn to serve them. This is not about punishment alone. It is about ensuring that justice is accessible to everyone, regardless of race, income, or status. Her words resonated deeply. Other victims, previously silenced by non-disclosure agreements, stepped forward to share their experiences. A young woman recounted being harassed by Reed outside her apartment complex. A retired teacher spoke about repeated stops on her way home from the grocery store. The public exposure of these stories pressured the city to follow through on the reforms Lillian demanded. the media coverage amplified the impact. Stories of Reed's misconduct, the cover-up by Foster and Carver, and the city's eventual reforms were broadcast nationally. Citizens across the country began questioning similar patterns in their own local police departments. Lillian's case became a model for addressing civil rights violations and ensuring accountability in law enforcement. Months later, Lillian walked through her garden again, the same space where her ordeal had begun. The flowers bloomed, the morning sun glimmered on freshly watered soil, and for the first time since that Tuesday, she felt a sense of peace. Her courage and meticulous preparation had brought justice, not just for herself, but for the community. The $750,000 settlement was only part of the story. The true victory was structural change. Officers were now required to follow clear protocols, complaints could no longer be ignored, and citizens could expect accountability. The systemic failures that had allowed Reed's misconduct to flourish were being dismantled, one policy at a time. Lillian understood that change was never immediate. Culture within the police department would take time to shift, and oversight mechanisms would need consistent enforcement. But she had proven that courage, evidence, and legal knowledge could overcome systemic negligence. The city, once embarrassed by the national spotlight, now had a roadmap for ethical policing. Officers were reminded that their duty was to protect all citizens, not to profile or intimidate. Supervisors were held accountable for oversight failures, ensuring that future misconduct could be addressed swiftly. For Lillian, the experience left a lasting impression. The morning in her garden had been ordinary, peaceful, and routine, until it became a crucible that tested every part of the justice system. What followed was extraordinary. The exposure of misconduct, federal investigations, arrests of high-ranking officers, public outrage, and ultimately, systemic reform. As she looked over her garden one last time before heading into the courthouse for another day of hearings, Lillian reflected on the journey. Justice, she realized, often required persistence, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. Her story was no longer just about her. It was a testament to the power of accountability and the importance of protecting civil rights. The city had paid $750,000 in compensation, yes, but the lessons learned extended far beyond money. Policies were rewritten, officers were retrained, and citizens could now feel a measure of security that had been absent for far too long. Lillian Harper had turned an unjust morning into a historic moment for civil rights and police reform, ensuring that future citizens could enjoy the safety and dignity they deserved. And so, the story of a morning garden, a racially motivated stop, and one federal judge's courage became a landmark case. It revealed the deep flaws in a system designed to protect citizens and demonstrated how one person's voice, backed by evidence and persistence, could change the course of an entire city. In the end, Lillian Harper's experience serves as a reminder. Even ordinary routines can intersect with injustice, but truth, courage, and accountability have the power to create lasting change.